You find what you look for, even monsters. From the Davis. I was about 15 when I found something unnatural out in the fields around a small Utah town. We thought they were empty, but they definitely were not. For those of you who grew up in fly-speck towns, you probably know that you have to find ways to entertain yourself, right? You can't go down to the mall or movies and all that jazz because those things aren't around. Some kids did drugs, some played video games, some others got into sports, but not me and my buddy. No. We decided it would be a good idea to start exploring the fields and mountains around our little town. If it were just during the day, it wouldn't have been quite as dangerous. But of course, we didn't keep our wandering to the daylight. There was more than one time we were out after dark, which was honestly idiotic. But hey, we aren't all smart when we are teens, right? So typically, it was just me and one of my buddies that went out looking for scary things. But this time we convinced 2 other guys to come with us. This night, it really struck me that when you go out looking for things, you tend to find them. We were all joking around, having a good time as we walked past this church on the very edge of town. The church was surrounded on 3 sides by the 6-ish foot tall white vinyl fences you see around. To get to the church from the field, you had to run around the fence to one corner, since the side of the church that faced the field was almost entirely fenced off. That will become pertinent later. So we headed out into the field. Now, the fields in this area weren't growing food. Instead, they were overgrown with sagebrush, most of it at least waist-high. I found a good-sized stick on the ground as we set out into the dark sagebrush. I always liked having a good stick in my hand, mostly for cutting up weeds. That's what I did under normal circumstances at least. Anyways, as we were heading out there, I started to get the feeling that something was a bit off. I had felt this before. As I said, me and one of my buddies made a habit of going out at night. Feeling this, I started looking around to see if we were alone in the sagebrush. That's when I first saw it. Something quite large was stalking us through the sagebrush. This thing was down on all 4s and was at least bear size, if not larger. It was a dark night, so I didn't get much detail, other than the general shape and size. Here's the problem, though. To my knowledge, a bear has never been seen in this area, and not this close to town especially. In the 7 years I lived there, the only real dangerous wildlife spotted was a mountain lion. One time. And this thing was too big to be that. I pointed out our stalker to my buddies. The guy who usually went out with me at night immediately believed me and started keeping an eye out. On the other hand, the other 2 guys just thought we were messing with them and trying to scare them, so they brushed it off. With how dark it was, and how careful this thing was as it stalked us, I only caught glimpses of it, and that meant I couldn't just point and say, "There it is." That obviously meant I was lying, right? Haha. Because they didn't believe me, we kept heading further into the fields. We had gotten close to half of a mile out into the sagebrush and away from that church on the edge of town. By this point, I had mentioned our stalker several times. Finally, the other 2 guys say, "There is nothing out here, but we should go back." The way they said it almost made me laugh, but I wasn't about to point out their contradicting statements. Going back seemed like a very good idea because this thing in the sagebrush had slowly been creeping closer to us. The 4 of us started going back to the edge of town, where the church was located, and our dark follower continued to trail us. When we were getting close to the church, it happened. We were maybe 100 yards away from the church and its streetlights. I still don't know how it happened, but I managed to fall quite far behind everyone else. So I was alone out there as they were just getting to the church. Maybe I was just watching this thing and walking slower. I really don't know. Whatever the case, I found myself alone, watching this enormous dark shape no longer stalking, but heading purposefully straight for me. At this point, I did something that may not have been the brightest. You know that stick I mentioned picking up before? Well, I drew my arm back and chucked that stick at the dark stalker, and then turned and ran like my life depended on it, which may be closer to the truth than I realized just then. As I burst into motion, charging for the church, this beast came tromping after me. I was so terrified I didn't even look back. I put my whole being into getting to the church as fast as I could. I doubt I've ever run faster in my entire life. As I neared the church and the light, it was right behind me. In fact, when I was about to reach the parking lot around the church, I could feel it right behind me. Have you ever had that experience where you can actually feel someone about to touch you the instant before they do? That's what I felt. It was about to catch hold of me, and there was nothing I could do. I knew I was about to die. Or so I thought. At the very moment I felt it reaching for me, I burst out of the dark and into the church parking lot. The instant I stumbled onto the church grounds, the feeling was gone, and I spun to look at my pursuer. There was nothing there. It was impossible. It was literally just there. I thought I was dead for sure, but the moment I reached the church grounds, it just vanished. I turned my head in every direction, looking for the thing that had nearly snatched me up. It couldn't just be gone. It couldn't. Then I spotted it on the field side of the white fence, in the farthest corner from me and the streetlight. It had somehow moved at least 100 feet in just a moment, which made me wonder why it didn't catch me before. Not only that, but it was far more massive than I previously thought. This thing stood chest and shoulder above the vinyl fence, a fence that was at least 6 feet tall. It was still very hard to see exactly what it was, as it was standing just outside where the light from the streetlight could reach. That said, from what I could tell, it did have a more humanoid shape to it. Part of me thought that maybe I was just seeing shadows. I may have stuck with that, if not for one thing. You know that feeling you get when waking up from a nightmare? That almost evil feeling? Simply looking in its direction gave me that feeling. So I know something was definitely there, something that had been a heartbeat away from grabbing me. If it had, who knows what would have happened? Whatever it was, dog man, demon, or something else, for some reason, it was not willing to come onto the church grounds. It kind of made me think that the holy ground thing from the stories may actually be true. This wasn't the first or last time that me and my buddy ran into these things. Yes, there was more than one. This was the closest call, though, and I still get the chills when I tell the story. So, a warning for all of you who are debating adventuring out to find scary or dangerous things. You always find what you look for, sooner or later. Goat Guy, from Unknown Anonymous. I was 7 when it all started. Near my neighborhood, there was a forest that everyone talked about. My friends and I were fascinated by it, mainly because of the scary and dark stories that surrounded the place. Officially, nobody was supposed to enter. The forest was fenced off by tall gates, probably to keep kids like us out. But of course, being bored children with nothing better to do, we always found a way in. Initially, there was this hole in the fence that made it easy to slip through. Even though it scared me to death, I usually went in only when accompanied by my friends. Eventually, the authorities noticed how kids were sneaking in, and they repaired the hole, putting a sturdier gate there. Little did they realize all my friends were expert climbers. So, despite the new barriers, We continued to enter by climbing over or finding other small openings they hadn't spotted yet. One day, things felt different. As we entered, we noticed changes in the landscape. 2 massive trees had fallen over, forcing us to crawl under and climb over them, making the whole forest feel strange and disorienting. None of these obstacles stopped us, though. Instead, it piqued our curiosity even more. Behind the forest was an overgrown path filled with millions of branches and dense bushes. None of us had ever explored that far, so we gathered a group and decided to see what lay beyond. As we pushed deeper into the woods, branches scratching at our arms and faces, we heard strange sounds. At first, it was faint footsteps, too loud and heavy to be just animals. Then came the goat noises. It sounds silly, I know, but that's exactly what we heard. Strange, unsettling bleating echoing through the trees. We tried to laugh it off, joking about the zoo being miles away and how impossible it was for a goat to be out here. But the sounds grew louder, closer, more intense. As we continued walking, I suddenly realized that the group had thinned out. I glanced back and saw only a couple of friends remained. They must have gotten scared and run off, my friend suggested. Though uneasy, we shrugged it off, deciding to keep moving. It wasn't long before darkness began to settle around us, signaling that it was probably past dinner time. Reluctantly, we turned around to head back home. That's when the noises intensified, surrounding us from every direction. My heart raced as the bleating filled my ears. Suddenly, right in front of us, a goat appeared. My entire body froze in fear, my limbs locked in place. My friend beside me was also paralyzed. Then, without warning, the goat lunged toward us. At the last possible second, my body finally responded, and I jumped out of the way. My friend wasn't as lucky. The goat grazed his knee, leaving a deep scratch. He shouted in pain, but there was no time to pause. "Run!" I screamed at him, adrenaline surging through my veins. We sprinted faster than we ever had before, crashing through branches and bushes in a desperate bid to escape. When I glanced behind us, my blood ran cold. The goat was now on 2 legs, sprinting after us at an incredible speed, its eyes glowing with a horrifying intensity. I yelled in terror, pushing my friend ahead of me, urging us both to move faster. We reached the fence at full speed. I managed to clear it in one swift jump, and my friend made a massive leap right behind me. When we turned around, the goat was gone, vanished as suddenly as it appeared. The only remnants of its presence were the disturbing sounds echoing in the forest, as if waiting for its next victim. That night at home, neither of us spoke about what happened. We ate dinner in tense silence, knowing deep down no one would believe our story. Moreover, we were terrified that someone from the government might come after us if we talked. It was a childish fear, but in our minds, it felt very real. Later, we stood outside, staring at the dark forest. My friend broke the silence, saying, "We should set a trap or something. What if someone else goes missing?" I tried reasoning with him, reminding him how close we'd come to serious harm. Yet somehow, he convinced me by simply asking, "What if other people go missing?" Even though my instincts screamed at me to stay away, I reluctantly agreed. "Fine, but you're doing it alone," I said, turning to leave. But before I knew it, he pulled me back, and we were heading into the woods again. He pointed at my arm, noticing a cut I hadn't even felt because of the adrenaline rush. I never wanted to go back there, but deep down I knew that as long as my friends insisted, I'd find myself wandering those dark woods again. The Summer Camp from Hell, from Anonymous. Growing up in a small rural town in northeast Tennessee, my childhood was filled with the shared experience of long summers, exploring the woods, and a sense of safety. At least, that's how it felt, until one particular summer changed everything. It was about 15 years ago, right around the time I was turning 9. Every summer, my grandmother, who watched me during school breaks, would sign me up for a summer camp that most of the kids in our town went to. I'd attended the same camp for a few years and had grown accustomed to it. Usually, it was held at an elementary school close to my grandmother's home, a familiar place with brightly painted classrooms and a playground I'd known like the back of my hand. But this summer, due to some maintenance work at our usual location, the camp was moved to another school in the district, one situated at the edge of town, near dense woods that stretched out for miles. On the first day, as my grandmother drove me up the winding road that led to the new school, I immediately felt uneasy. It wasn't fear exactly, just an odd sensation in the pit of my stomach, a sort of instinctual apprehension. My grandmother parked, gave me a reassuring smile, and told me she'd be back at 4. As I stepped out of the car, the oppressive weight of the surrounding woods pressed down on me. The towering trees cast elongated shadows across the grass. I walked toward the school's entrance, each step amplifying my discomfort. My breathing quickened slightly, and a chill crept down my spine despite the warmth of the morning sun. Thankfully, my aunt, who worked at the camp, was standing near the doorway. Her bright smile eased some of my anxiety as she greeted me and walked me over to the sign-in table. Still, something deep inside kept tugging at my nerves, making it impossible for me to fully relax. The morning passed slowly, filled with activities designed to help the kids get to know each other and feel comfortable. Familiar faces from previous summers were there, friends I had grown accustomed to seeing every year. By lunchtime, I felt a little better, convinced the earlier feeling had just been my imagination acting up due to the new surroundings. After we ate, the counselors took us outside for free play, and I immediately gravitated toward my group of friends. We chased each other around the playground, laughter echoing across the schoolyard. Behind the playground, however, was an imposing wall of trees marking the beginning of the forest. They stood thick and dark, so dense you could hardly see more than a few feet beyond the edge. I'd never been afraid of the woods before. Back home, my friends and I would spend hours exploring trails and climbing trees. But something felt fundamentally different about these woods, something unsettling that I couldn't put my finger on. While playing tag, I stopped abruptly near the edge of the playground to catch my breath. As I stood there panting, an unexplainable urge compelled me to look towards the trees. That's when I saw it. Deep in the shadows of the forest stood a figure. At first, I thought it was just an odd reflection of sunlight playing tricks on my eyes through the branches. But as I squinted to get a better look, my blood ran cold. The figure was humanoid, but grotesquely tall and impossibly thin. Its pale skin seemed stretched tightly over sharp bones, giving it an eerie, skeletal appearance. Even from a distance, its eyes stood out clearly, bright, glowing yellow-green orbs fixed unblinkingly on me. A wave of nausea overcame me, yet I found myself bizarrely drawn toward it. My feet moved without my conscious control, stepping slowly closer to the woods, each stride feeling heavier and heavier. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and just as I was about to cross the playground boundary and into the tree line, something inside me snapped. A sudden surge of primal fear released my paralysis, and I turned sharply, sprinting back toward the playground equipment. I ducked beneath the metal slide, crouching low and trembling. Peering cautiously around the corner, I saw the figure hadn't moved. Then, slowly and deliberately, it shifted. Its entire body rotated to face me directly, still partially obscured by shadows, but undeniably focused on me. Unable to handle the terror alone, I bolted toward the nearest teacher. Tears streaming down my cheeks, I pointed frantically at the creature, my words spilling out in frantic bursts. The teacher glanced toward the woods, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. After a moment, she knelt to my level, gently assuring me that nothing was there, that my imagination was simply playing tricks on me. I wanted to believe her. I desperately wanted to. But when I turned back, the figure was still watching, unmoving, but undeniably real. Feeling defeated and frightened, I moved cautiously toward the swings, positioning myself so I could keep an eye on the woods. As I swung slowly back and forth, the figure never once took its eyes off me. When the counselor's whistle finally blew, signaling our return inside, relief washed over me. But just before turning away, the figure slowly raised a long, emaciated arm. In a deliberate motion, it waved goodbye, its spindly fingers moving in an exaggerated, grotesque gesture. Then, without another movement, it melted back into the shadows, vanishing as if it had never been there. Back inside, surrounded by chatter and laughter, I couldn't shake the dread that had settled deep within me. I didn't dare tell anyone else about what I'd seen, not even my closest friends. I spent the rest of the day feeling isolated, glancing anxiously toward the windows every few minutes, terrified of what I might see lurking just beyond the trees. Throughout the rest of that day, I barely participated in activities. Every chance I got, my eyes drifted toward the windows, scanning the tree line for any hint of movement. The wooded area, once just an inviting place for exploration, now felt dark, threatening, as if a new danger lurked within. When lunchtime finally arrived, I grabbed my food and took a seat at a table by the far wall, away from the windows and the view of the forest beyond. My aunt noticed how quiet I'd become and walked over to sit beside me. She gently placed a hand on my shoulder, asking softly if everything was all right. For a moment, I considered telling her the truth about the strange, pale figure with hollow eyes that had waved to me from the shadows. But the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly explain something like that without sounding crazy? Instead, I forced a small smile and shook my head. "I'm just tired," I said quietly, hoping that she would believe my weak excuse. She hesitated, clearly unconvinced, but then nodded slowly. "Well, if you need anything, you know you can talk to me, right?" I nodded again, this time genuinely grateful for her kindness. But as soon as she walked away, the anxiety rushed back, stronger than before. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I kept close to the other campers, never allowing myself to be alone, even for a moment. But every time we passed near the playground doors or windows facing the woods, a chill ran through me, and my stomach twisted into knots. Eventually, the day began to wind down, and the counselors announced that our final activity would be outside, back on the playground. My heart immediately started racing. I desperately wanted to stay indoors, to hide within the safety of the walls, but I knew that refusing would attract unwanted attention. Reluctantly, I followed the group outside, feeling like I was walking toward my own doom. The sunlight was lower now, casting long, dark shadows across the playground and into the woods beyond. My friends quickly ran toward the swings and slides, laughing and shouting as though nothing had changed. But I remained at the edge of the play area, cautiously scanning the woods. At first, everything seemed normal. The trees were still, the branches quiet. I began to think that perhaps I had imagined the entire thing, that my fear had created something monstrous from shadows and leaves. But then, as if on cue, something moved deep within the trees. My blood turned cold. There it was again, the pale, thin figure, stepping deliberately from behind a tree. It stood perfectly still, watching me intently, its yellow-green eyes burning with an unnatural brightness. My pulse thundered in my ears as I struggled not to scream. It slowly lifted its bony arm again, waving gently, almost mockingly, before retreating back into the darkness. This time I didn't wait to see what else it might do. I turned and sprinted toward the nearest counselor, desperate for safety and reassurance, knowing now with absolute certainty that whatever I had seen wasn't just a trick of my imagination. It was real, and it was waiting for me. The days continued to pass slowly, each moment spent at the camp weighing heavier on me than the last. I tried my best to blend into the normal routines, laughing and playing with friends, but my eyes constantly scanned the tree line. I could never shake the feeling that something out there was still watching, waiting patiently for the right moment. It was on one particularly hot and muggy afternoon when the day seemed especially thick. The air was heavy, humid, and buzzing with the electric hum of cicadas. The camp counselors announced an outdoor activity, a hike through the nature trails winding around the perimeter of the school property, edging right along the woods. My heart instantly sank. I didn't want to go, but there was no option to stay behind, and there was no way to convince them that my fear was justified. Reluctantly, I lined up with the other campers, feeling a lump in my throat that refused to disappear. My feet dragged along the grass as we made our way toward the trail entrance. As we entered the shaded pathway, the shadows of tall, twisted trees immediately closed around us, their branches clawing skyward like grasping fingers. My pulse quickened, and I glanced around nervously, certain I'd see that pale, skeletal figure at any moment. The deeper into the trail we walked, the quieter everything became. The sounds of insects and birds faded away until the only noise was our feet crunching softly against the dry earth. The silence felt unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I stole glances at my friends and the counselors, but they all seemed oblivious to the overwhelming dread that crept over me. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise, not far behind us, breaking the tense quiet. I spun around instinctively, but saw nothing, only the silent, unmoving trees. A counselor noticed my alarmed expression and asked softly, "Everything all right?" I hesitated for a moment before nodding quickly, afraid they'd dismiss me again as paranoid. But as soon as we continued onward, the rustling came again, louder this time, accompanied by what sounded like shallow, labored breathing. The hair stood up on my neck as panic began to rise inside me. I couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, I stopped abruptly, and my counselor turned again, annoyed this time. "What's going on now?" she asked impatiently. "There's someone in the woods," I whispered urgently, pointing into the trees. Everyone halted, confused and some amused. A few campers giggled nervously. The counselor rolled her eyes slightly and began to assure everyone there was nothing to be afraid of. But her voice trailed off suddenly, eyes widening as she stared past me into the darkness. Slowly, I turned my head, dread filling my chest. Standing just beyond the tree line was the pale creature, far closer than before. It towered over us, its emaciated frame bending awkwardly, arms hanging loosely at its sides. Its glowing yellow-green eyes fixed directly on mine, unblinking and intense. It took another slow, deliberate step forward, revealing long, skeletal fingers tipped with sharp, dirty nails. Someone behind me screamed, breaking the trance-like silence. Chaos erupted. Counselors shouted for everyone to run back toward the school. Children scrambled, crying and stumbling over each other in panic. My heart hammered wildly as I turned and bolted, legs pumping harder than ever before. As we fled, I could hear the creature behind us, a guttural growling mixed with the sickening crackle of branches and dry leaves as it pursued us. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw its unnatural limbs propelling it swiftly, movements disturbingly jerky yet horrifyingly efficient. It gained ground quickly, its eyes never losing their intense, hungry glow. I felt my lungs burning as the school's entrance came into view. The others had already reached it, and counselors frantically ushered children inside. I was just yards away when I tripped over something, causing me to stumble and fall forward onto the grass. Pain flared up in my knee, but adrenaline pushed me back to my feet immediately. Turning back instinctively, I saw the creature looming over me, towering and impossibly thin, its skeletal hand outstretched. I screamed and scrambled backwards, eyes wide with terror. Just as it stepped out of the trees toward me, one of the counselors lunged forward, grabbing me roughly and pulling me back towards safety. The door slammed shut behind us, and we collapsed onto the cold, tiled hallway floor, gasping for air. No one spoke as we listened to the frantic scraping and clawing on the other side of the door. Then, suddenly, it stopped, replaced once again by eerie silence. Later, adults combed the woods, trying to find any sign of the creature. But they found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no evidence at all. Eventually, they dismissed the incident as a bare sighting or mass hysteria caused by the heat. But I knew better. Years later, that event still haunts me. Every night when the shadows stretch across my bedroom walls, I feel those eyes upon me again, watching from the darkness. Even now, far away from that town, the memory remains vivid. Something was out there in those woods, and though I've never seen it again, I know it's still out there, waiting. The Birdman, from Peepo. Back in 2017, I went camping in the High Tatras in Slovakia with my dad. It was a tradition that my grandfather started. We thought that it was going to be a peaceful trip, but the truth was far from that. For context, I was 12 back then and was kind of chubby, so I ran really slow. But that's only going to be important later in the story. We drove there in my dad's old Renault. We arrived late at night. Luckily, Dad booked a hotel room so we could get some rest and prepare for the woods. In the morning, we ate some breakfast and went on foot for about a mile to get to the station to catch a chairlift to the hill where we would begin our hike to the camp where we should spend the next night. About halfway there, we had a little break to eat and drink because it was about the time when we eat lunch at home. As we were sitting on stones, we heard this screech. It was really loud, like the thing making it was really close. I asked Dad about it, and he said that it was probably just a big bird and not to worry about it. When we finally arrived at the camping spot, it was already about 6 p.m. We built our tent and tried to make a fire, but all the wood was wet from the melting snow. We didn't know what to do, but I remembered that the bark from birch burns quite good even if wet, so we went around the campground trying to find some birches. After about 15 minutes, Dad found one. We took our knives and cut some bark from the tree. We returned to the tent and successfully made a fire. Satisfied, we took out our MREs because my dad was a soldier and had some spare ones, so he took them home. After eating, we took out our sleeping bags and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, around 2 a.m., I heard the screeching sound again. This time it seemed even closer. I woke up Dad and told him that the big bird is here again. He stepped out of the tent with his .357 revolver in one hand and a flashlight in the other. After about 3 minutes, he came back wide-eyed and told me that he saw a silhouette about 2 meters tall trying to hide behind a tree, though it was still visible. He told me that it seemed to have wings but no feathers. Right after he said that, we heard the screeching sound again. Dad looked out the still-opened tent door, pointed his revolver, and shot 2 shots. We didn't hear the screeches again that night. When we woke up, we went out and tried to look for the creature if Dad actually hit it. But we haven't found it, only the bullet hole in a tree, and the second one was nowhere to be seen. We packed up our stuff and went back to the chairlift station to get home. As we were walking, I registered movement in the corner of my eye. I looked in the direction, and there it was, a 2-meter-tall pale body. Its arms were attached to its body with wing-like tight skin. I looked at its head and saw a hairless head, but it had a beak. The beak was the same pale color as its skin. The eyes were huge and black. We ran, but since I was chubby and slow, I tripped on a root and fell. The screeches began sounding, and the forest made it, so it was sounding like the trees were screaming at us. Dad turned around and helped me stand up. Luckily, we came back right to the station. We never came back into the woods again. If anyone has the same or similar experience, I would be happy to know that me and my dad aren't in this alone. No picnics in the woods. From Anonymous. My name is Anna, and what I'm about to share happened sometime in the summer of 2012. At the time, I was 17 years old and had recently started dating a girl named Claire. We lived in a small rural town in eastern Tennessee, a place surrounded by thick forests and winding roads that led deeper into the hills. It was picturesque during the day, but could feel isolated and eerie once night fell. On one warm afternoon, Claire and I decided to head out to a secluded spot in the local woods for a quiet picnic. It wasn't an uncommon activity for us. We enjoyed being outdoors, away from the watchful eyes of our conservative community. Though our relationship was not a secret, we preferred not to draw attention to ourselves. The woods were always a place of peace for us, a chance to escape and simply enjoy each other's company. We packed a simple lunch: sandwiches, fruit, some chips, and bottled water. Claire drove her blue Toyota Tacoma, an older model she was immensely proud of, boasting about its reliability more times than I could count. After about 20 minutes of driving, we arrived at the edge of the woods. There was a makeshift parking area where a few locals would sometimes park when hiking or hunting. Today it was empty, and we felt lucky to have the place to ourselves. We grabbed our lunch and a small blanket from the truck bed and started walking along a familiar trail that led deeper into the forest. The day was bright, the sunlight filtering through the leaves overhead, casting patches of light onto the path. Birds chirped lazily, and the faint rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze was calming. After about 10 minutes of walking, we found our usual clearing near a small creek. It was shaded but still warm, the perfect spot for our picnic. We spread out our blanket and started unpacking our lunch, chatting about our plans for the upcoming school year and our dreams for the future. At that moment, everything felt perfect. But gradually, as we sat there, a strange sensation began to creep over me. It was subtle at first, just a prickling at the back of my neck, the kind you get when someone is staring at you. I glanced around, expecting to see someone hiking nearby, but the woods around us remained silent and still. Claire noticed my unease and asked me if I was all right. "I'm not sure," I replied honestly. "I just feel like we're being watched." She laughed gently and squeezed my hand reassuringly. It's probably just your imagination. We've been out here plenty of times. I wanted to agree with her, but the feeling wouldn't subside. Still, I tried to push it aside, focusing instead on Claire's stories and laughter. After finishing our meal, we cleaned up, careful not to leave any trash behind. As we stood to gather our belongings, Claire paused, suddenly alert. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I strained my ears, listening closely. For a moment, all was silent. Then, unmistakably, I heard footsteps approaching through the underbrush, deliberate and heavy. Claire moved instinctively closer to me, placing herself slightly in front of me as we both stared into the thick trees. A few tense seconds later, a man emerged onto the path about 30 feet away from us. He was large, overweight, with a messy beard and disheveled clothes. I noticed immediately the handgun holstered at his side. He stared directly at us, his eyes intense, unblinking. My heartbeat quickened, and I reached for Claire's hand, my palm slick with sweat. "Afternoon," Claire said cautiously, clearly attempting to keep the tension out of her voice. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, just continued to stare at us. The silence dragged painfully until he finally spoke, his voice rough and aggressive. "You girls shouldn't be out here alone. It ain't safe." Claire shifted slightly, positioning herself even more protectively in front of me. "We're just having lunch. We're heading out now," she said firmly, but calmly. The man's expression twisted into something uglier, his eyes narrowing. "Girls like you don't belong here," he spat, taking a deliberate step closer. "It ain't right." I felt my chest tighten, fear clawing at my throat. Claire squeezed my hand, silently communicating to me not to respond. She spoke again, maintaining her composure. "We were just leaving." Without another word, we quickly began moving back along the path, hoping he wouldn't follow. But as soon as we turned our backs, I heard his heavy footsteps behind us, matching our pace. My heart thundered in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Claire glanced at me, her eyes wide with alarm, confirming what I already feared. He was following us. We quickened our steps, almost breaking into a jog, but careful not to panic completely. Still, he stayed close behind, breathing heavily, muttering things under his breath. The woods, which had always been a source of peace, now felt threatening, every tree casting dark shadows that seemed to reach out for us. "Keep walking," Claire whispered urgently, her voice tight. We were still at least 5 minutes from the truck, and the path ahead seemed endless. Behind us, the man's footsteps quickened, and he began shouting after us, his words filled with malice. His voice echoed through the trees, making my stomach churn. "Get back here!" he shouted. "You can't just walk away from me." I felt tears stinging my eyes, but I forced them back, focusing solely on moving forward. Claire gripped my hand so tightly it hurt, but I welcomed the pain. It grounded me. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the trees, sharp and unmistakable. A gunshot. Panic surged through me, and we began to run, desperation fueling us as we sprinted toward the parking area. "Keep going," Claire shouted, her voice strained with fear. Another gunshot rang out, closer this time, hitting a nearby tree and sending splinters of bark flying around us. My mind raced with terror. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. He was genuinely trying to hurt us. We ran faster, breathless and terrified, the parking area finally coming into view. We burst into the clearing where Claire's blue Toyota Tacoma sat waiting for us, the familiar sight offering a brief flicker of relief amid the terror. Claire frantically dug the keys from her pocket, her hands shaking so badly that she nearly dropped them. I looked back toward the path we'd just fled, my breath ragged, heart slamming painfully against my ribs. I couldn't see the man yet, but the sound of branches snapping told me he wasn't far behind. "Hurry!" I urged, my voice barely a whisper, as Claire struggled to unlock the doors. The second the locks clicked open, we scrambled inside. Claire shoved the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. As she threw the truck into reverse, our pursuer stumbled out of the woods, still gripping his handgun, fury etched deeply into his face. He raised the weapon, aiming it directly at us. Instinctively, I ducked down, shielding my head with trembling arms. Another gunshot shattered the tense silence, striking somewhere behind us. Claire slammed her foot on the accelerator, the tires spinning momentarily before finally gaining traction on the gravel. The truck lurched backward, and she quickly spun us around to face the road, the back end fishtailing wildly. "Hold on!" she shouted, voice strained as she gripped the wheel tightly. We tore down the narrow road, dust and gravel kicking up behind us. My hands shook violently, and tears blurred my vision as I reached for my cell phone, struggling to dial 911 through the adrenaline haze. I barely managed to explain our location and situation to the dispatcher, my voice breaking with each word. "Officers are on their way. Keep driving and try to reach the main highway," the calm voice instructed. Claire nodded determinedly as I relayed the instructions, her jaw set, knuckles white on the steering wheel. We sped along the winding road, each turn and dip of the terrain threatening to send us off course. I glanced repeatedly in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man's vehicle chasing us down. A minute later, my heart sank. A large, lifted truck barreled out from a hidden side road, rapidly closing the distance between us. Claire's eyes flicked to the mirror, her face pale. "He's following us," she whispered, panic seeping into her voice. "Keep going," I urged desperately. "Don't slow down." The truck tailgated us dangerously close, engine roaring loudly, the aggressive driver swerving back and forth as if trying to intimidate us into pulling over. My pulse pounded in my ears, and the edges of my vision darkened with fear. "Where are the police?" Claire's voice cracked as another shot echoed, the sound muffled but unmistakable. A moment later, the right side mirror exploded, shards of glass raining against the window. I screamed, ducking lower in my seat, heart racing uncontrollably. "He's shooting at us! Claire!" She didn't respond, her eyes locked forward, face set with determination. Suddenly, she took a sharp turn onto a narrow side road, tires squealing as the truck nearly flipped. Behind us, the pursuing vehicle overshot the turn, careening into a ditch with a loud crash. It bought us a few precious moments to put distance between us. We raced toward the main highway, relief flooding me as flashing blue and red lights appeared on the horizon, speeding toward us. Claire pulled off to the side as several police cruisers flew past, heading directly toward the scene we'd just left behind. Once stopped, we both sat frozen for a moment, the silence inside the truck broken only by our ragged breaths. Claire reached out, gripping my hand tightly, offering comfort even as her own hand trembled. A police officer approached moments later, tapping lightly on the window. Claire rolled it down, visibly shaken but trying to hold herself together. "Are you two all right?" the officer asked gently, concern clear in her eyes. "He shot at us," I stammered, my voice barely audible. "He chased us from the woods." We spent the next hour giving our statements, recounting every terrifying detail we could remember. The officers assured us repeatedly that the man would be apprehended and that we'd done everything right by calling for help immediately. As they spoke, reports crackled over their radios, eventually confirming that the man had been caught without further incident. Later, we learned the man had a disturbing history. Apparently, he'd been involved in several previous altercations with hikers and campers, though none had escalated quite so dangerously before. Knowing he would finally face justice offered only minimal comfort, though it didn't erase the deep trauma that lingered. The drive back home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process the day's horrifying events. When we finally reached Claire's driveway, she turned off the ignition, but didn't immediately move to exit the truck. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I never should have insisted on going there." "This isn't your fault," I assured her, squeezing her hand tightly. "We couldn't have known." She nodded slowly, her eyes wet with tears. "I just can't stop thinking about what could have happened." "We're safe now," I reminded her softly, trying to convince myself as much as her. "We'll get through this." Years have passed since that terrifying summer day, but neither of us has forgotten it. Claire and I eventually went our separate ways, though we remained close friends, forever bonded by the trauma we'd survived. Even now, the sight of dense woods sends a shiver down my spine, a grim reminder that sometimes the darkest dangers aren't hidden deep within forests. They walk among us, unnoticed, until it's nearly too late. It waits in the pasture. From B Green 2660. Okay, so I'm a simple kid who lives in the middle of nowhere, and I was very skeptical before. But I realize there are things that have been here for thousands of years, and they'll be here for 1,000 years after I'm gone. Now I know that it seems really odd that there are things in the woods that no one knows about, but maybe it is because it's meant to stay that way. Now I was a skeptic until my cousin's haunting a few years back, which I'm having someone work on it if we could actually get through a whole conversation. But it's safe to say I've never been the same since. Now, the story. About a month ago, I was having strange dreams. The first was of a pale and flat-faced skinwalker, with slits for eyes and a mouth peering at me through my window. Now, just so you know, my window sits a good 6 to 7 feet off the ground, because I live in a trailer house on blocks. The second dream, I was pinned down on my bed by a little dark gray, almost black creature, maybe 3 to 4 feet tall, with very little to almost no hair, and it was stabbing its nails in me, and its nails were about 6 inches long and sharpened at the end. While it's stabbing me, I look at my clock, and it said 9 o'clock. Then my dream switches to 8:59. Now, if you haven't heard of something like this, just so you know, it happens a lot more than you think. Then it almost hops. It uses its front legs to swing its back legs forward, almost like a monkey through the hallway, then turns and says, "You'll probably do just fine." Then attacks me. I wake up, cold sweats, shaking, hyperventilating, yada yada yada. But that's not what's scary. Until then, the third dream, I'm walking through my pasture, and I see something fall. So I turn to look and see this massive deer turn, smile, and stand up, take a couple of steps toward me, then scream and walk off. Now, as I said, that is not the scary part. The scary part is the day after I took the dogs out to do the call back to nature, and I saw a white thing hiding behind the Scout, one of the dozen dead vehicles. Its shoulders were taller than the Scout, and once I looked at it, it started to slowly slink down behind it. But what made me, emphasis on the made me, is because if they don't want you to see them, then you won't. Simple as that. See, it was the extremely long arms going up so that I can just go straight down. So I rushed the dogs inside and once again had to take them out for the same reason. I kept my eye on the scout just in case, but I felt like I was being watched and heard the sound of the dogs whining. And these are German Shepherd Pit Bull mixes, and they aren't afraid of anything. But I turned to see a white face and arms wrapped around the hood of the car. Then, when I moved to get a better look, it ducked and hid from me. And today, about 3 hours ago, I heard a call from a chicken. I know that sounds funny, but because my uncle has one rooster, and it was calling back and forth with something else that sounded like the Mexican dude from Predators, Cuchillo. Then heavy running, almost like one of our horses, but they were both in sight, so... I'm not asking for help. Just what could I do that would not involve silver bullets, white ash, and something like that because I'm young, and it hasn't messed with me. So what should I do? I'm not sure it's a skinwalker or wendigo. Never been real clear on that. I know that they're just not nice. Oh, it's a little late in the story, but we find all kinds of bones laying around. And when my cousins were little, they were being watched when they were younger. So their mom put up aluminum foil on the windows. Not just that, but to keep in heat and block out cold. I put that in last because it's not that scary, and it had a real function so it could seem not real. Anyways, avoid any uncultured land, because you never know what may watch, scream, and chase you. This is why I don't like going to state parks at noon or night. From Dominguez. In the pandemic, since we couldn't visit friends and basically were stuck inside the whole time, my dad got us into a habit of going to new places, like national and state parks. One day my dad asked us if we wanted to go to a state park to spend the night. My little brother was excited, but I, on the other hand, I was not. I'm afraid of the dark, and staying outside for a whole night seemed horrible. Since I live in Fort Worth, it's about 1 hour away. I love looking at the trees and landmarks of Texas. Once we got to the park, it was noon. My dad told me and my mom to put up the tents, and he would get firewood. So after we finished, my dad was nearly done starting the fire. We made dinner over the campfire, roasted some marshmallows, and went to sleep. But not before my dad wanted to tell us some scary stories about sightings of skinwalkers and other monstrous things in these woods. I didn't believe him and went to my tent, not wanting to hear about it anymore. I couldn't keep those stories out of my mind as I tossed and turned, but eventually fell into a fitful sleep. I'm a heavy sleeper, and it takes a lot to wake me up. In the middle of the night, I heard a big thud and a screech, followed by the sounds of something large and heavy coming towards our campsite. I opened my tent a little bit and turned on my flashlight. It was dark, like pitch black dark, and the sounds seemed so loud in the still quiet of the night. I was terrified beyond reason, and then I see a big, pale, tall creature looking at me, and it slowly walks back into the woods after it noticed I was looking at it. I couldn't sleep that whole night and told my dad in the morning, and although he didn't believe me, thinking I was trying to get back at him for the scary stories, he did admit to hearing something earlier in the night. And that's why I don't camp anymore. Something is stalking us. From Sappher. So, for the past 2.5 years, we've been having this issue with something stalking us. We've never seen it, but we know it's there. We live in northern Indiana, about 10 minutes from the Michigan border. The biggest predator we have up here are lynxes and a few sightings of wolves. Nothing bigger than that around here other than deer. Well, it all started when I first started listening to Darkness Prevails, and I started getting into supernatural creatures. The one that really caught my eye was the Wendigo. I didn't know at the time you aren't supposed to say its name. I remember telling my boyfriend and my mom about it, and that's around the time it started. There was one night I was working the closing shift at McDonald's. That night, my boyfriend was working with us, so one of my co-workers dropped me off. The spot I live in used to be a campground before they closed down and sold different parts to people to build homes on. It's actually my in-laws' house, and they've been there for over 18 years. Oh, and it's heavily wooded. There are no streetlights because it's all private property. Well, that night after work, my coworker took me home. It was around 1, maybe 2 in the morning when we finished closing up. On our way to my house, we were just talking and joking around. We get about 5 minutes from my house and noticed there was blood on the road. We didn't see anything until we went a little further up. Whatever it was looked like it got hit by a semi and dragged a bit before sliding off. The weird thing about this animal body is that it was as big as a deer, but with long, shaggy black fur. Now, I've never known a deer to look like that, and I've been living in a small town surrounded by woods almost my whole life. Well, the next day rolls around, and my boyfriend and I are going to work. We took the same road that the thing got hit on. The first thing I noticed was the blood that was still there but no body. I told my boyfriend about it, and he just brushed it off. When we got to work, my coworker who dropped me off was there, and I brought it up to him. He said on his way back through, whatever it was gone. Where that thing had been hit wasn't even 5 minutes from my house. We've noticed small things here and there. Sometimes we would sit on our front deck and smoke, and out of nowhere our dog would start to growl. We've heard something big stepping on branches, and we would run inside. We had this incident in October of 2023, where we had sat on our small back porch to smoke. We got uncomfortable immediately because we couldn't see anything past the deck. Our backyard has a fence around it, and our chickens are in the backyard as well. That night was kind of windy but nice and warm out still. I remember sitting there after having my turn to smoke, and I just got this uncomfortable feeling. One thing about me is, I always pay attention to my surroundings. I noticed that it was dead quiet. The neighbors down the street had a dog that was always barking, but it was quiet as well as the rooster that always seems to be awake all hours of the day and night. I remember telling my boyfriend that I think we should go inside, but he brushed me off and said I was being paranoid. Not even 5 seconds after he said that, we heard a huge branch snap. We both looked up and couldn't see anything outside the fence. We ran inside very fast and didn't go out the rest of that night. Then there was the time I can't remember if it was before or after the incident in October, but it was raining outside and we were in the advisory of a bad thunderstorm. My boyfriend realized he forgot something out in the car and quickly went to grab it. It was taking him forever, and I couldn't figure out why. After a few minutes, I went to check on him, and he came bursting through the back door. He said he got stuck in the car because of a deer. He told me that when he got into the car, he shut the door, and when he went to get out, there was a deer just standing there at the door. I haven't really seen my boyfriend that shaken up before, so I believed him. We didn't hear much of that thing for a while other than twigs snapping and our dog occasionally growling, but it stayed back until we started hearing cows out of nowhere. There are no cows close to our house. There were some in the back of the neighborhood, but there were quite a few houses and woods between us, and we never heard the cows before. But this was different. It was like something trying to mimic a cow and getting it wrong. It sounded like it was in pain, and it was just all wrong. I remember having our curtain for the window down, but we were both too scared to look outside in the dark. I remember hanging the curtain back up without looking outside, and it all stopped. Needless to say, we didn't sleep much that night. In the winter of 2024, we found weird, large footprints at my dad's house. He only lives about 7 minutes away from us, and at the time, me and my boyfriend were at my dad's. I had found out I was pregnant not too long ago and couldn't keep it from my mom, so I went down there to see her. After we saw those prints, we got out of there. I don't know what this thing is, and I don't want to know. It's been quiet since I've had my daughter, but I'm scared it'll come back. It's never shown itself, but maybe it was that deer that trapped my boyfriend. The Purple Castle. From Wesley C. Green. I was about 18 when this happened. We had a friend who was in law enforcement, and he had shared some of his strange and ghostly encounters over the years in our area. One weekend, 3 friends and I loaded up in my '65 Chevy pickup truck. It was fresh out of the paint shop. My dad, a few friends, and I had spent a full year restoring it from the frame up. It was my first truck, and I was proud of it. We drove out to a place known as the Purple Castle. It was said to have originally been built as a playhouse for the original owner's daughter. When the property was later sold, it became a small private family church. It was painted purple and had a steeple with a gold cross on top. Eventually, the building was abandoned and stood vacant for several years. Rumors began to circulate that it was being used for devil worship. Local legend had it that if you drove down the narrow one-car driveway at midnight, turned around in the parking lot, and began driving back out, the cross on the steeple would mysteriously light up and flash a purple color. Intrigued and feeling adventurous, we decided to test out this legend for ourselves. We slowly drove down the dark, narrow path with our lights turned off. Once we reached the parking lot, we turned around and began driving back out. About halfway down the driveway, we suddenly saw a bright flash, and something large and dark landed heavily in the bed of my truck. We could feel the weight shift as it began walking toward the rear window. Panicking, I punched the gas, racing toward the safety of street lamps and the open road. Once I hit the main road and found sufficient lighting, I slammed on the brakes and jumped out, grabbing an axe from behind the seat. Whatever it was, leaped from the truck bed, hitting the ground with a heavy thud, and bolted toward the nearby woods. It quickly disappeared behind a large tree, then peered out from behind it, staring back at us. Shaken and terrified, we quickly piled back into the truck and got out of there as fast as possible. None of us were eager to stick around and investigate further. The next day, I inspected my truck and found enormous footprints and claw marks gouged deeply into the wooden bed. There were also 2 huge handprints with long, distinct claw marks etched into the metal roof, necessitating another paint job. We never returned to those woods again, and to this day, I don't know what exactly we encountered. It stood at least 7 feet tall, was heavily muscular, dark, almost black in color, and had to weigh at least 400 pounds. Its skin wasn't exactly hairy, but it wasn't entirely smooth either. It's hard to explain, but one thing was for sure. It definitely wasn't human. The Day I Can't Forget. From Ash the Eepy Boy. It is hungry. I was walking down a dirt path outside my hometown when I suddenly spotted something unusual. Something definitely not right. I couldn't quite figure out what it was. Was it a man? A woman? I couldn't tell. Whatever it wasn't normal. It made me uncomfortable and uneasy as it stared at me from the tree line. Its silhouette was distorted and strange, standing oddly still in the shadows. I quickly turned around to see if anyone else was nearby. But when I looked back, the figure was slowly retreating deeper into the cover of the trees. My heart dropped, and a sudden urge to flee overcame me. Without thinking, I turned around and started sprinting as if my life depended on it. I don't know whether it was fight or flight, but I ran as fast as my legs could carry me back toward town. In a panic, I burst through the doors of the town's police station, breathing heavily and nearly collapsing from exhaustion and fear. A woman near the entrance quickly came to my aid, helping me regain my balance. With a trembling voice and wide eyes, I tried to explain what I had seen to the officer behind the front desk. "Are you okay, sir?" he asked, concerned by my frantic state. "No," I gasped, struggling to steady my breathing. "There's something dangerous in the woods. It wasn't human, but it looked like a person. I don't know exactly what it was, but it isn't safe out there." The officer paused for a moment, seemingly considering my words. Then, without warning, he began to laugh. The other officers behind him joined in, and even the woman who'd initially helped me was smiling slightly. My stomach sank. Once their laughter subsided, the officer behind the desk gave me a stern look. "Listen, kid," he said firmly, his voice suddenly serious. "This isn't some joke or a prank. You can't just come running in here claiming you're in danger. This is a police station, and we handle real problems. Do you understand me?" I clenched my fists, feeling disbelief and frustration boiling inside me. "I'm not joking," I pleaded desperately. "I'm telling you, there's something out there." He cut me off abruptly. Do I make myself clear? Realizing I was fighting a losing battle, I sighed deeply and nodded. It felt like every movie I'd ever seen, where a young person tries to warn authorities about something dangerous and gets dismissed. I wasn't going back into those woods anytime soon, that was for sure. The next few weeks passed by without incident, and I started to convince myself that perhaps it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Yet, deep down, I knew what I'd seen. The creature haunted my dreams, becoming a recurring figure in my nightmares. Sometimes, when I glanced toward the forest line visible from my parents' home, I swore I saw the shadowy outline lurking just beyond sight, watching me. Our town was somewhat stuck in time. It was 2012, and although mobile phones were popular everywhere else, our town hadn't fully embraced modern technology. People still used old wall-mounted house phones, and most TVs still had antennas perched on top. This gave our little town an eerie atmosphere, especially when older residents would eye newcomers suspiciously, casting judgmental glances as though we were the outsiders. I felt their eyes on me often, heightening my anxiety and paranoia. One particular day, I was walking down the sidewalk, minding my own business, when suddenly a shouting match erupted between an elderly man and a younger woman. From what I could initially gather, the older man was upset about her dress, claiming it was inappropriate. The strange thing was, as I listened more closely, their words started sounding foreign, almost like another language entirely. It disturbed me deeply. The very next day, the exact same argument unfolded again, at the exact same time and place, involving the same people. My mind raced as I quickly retreated toward my house, questioning whether it was mere coincidence or something more sinister. Before I could fully grasp the situation, the loud ring of the kitchen phone interrupted my thoughts. I raced to answer before my parents could get to it. "Turn on the news," my mom's friend urged anxiously on the other end. "There's been an incident near town." I dropped the receiver and ran to switch on the television. A reporter solemnly announced that local authorities had discovered a horrific murder in the woods. A hunter was found gruesomely mutilated, his body suspended from the branches by his own entrails, decapitated, and eyes gouged out. My heart nearly stopped. I felt sick to my stomach and wanted to collapse right there. Stumbling upstairs to my bedroom to escape reality, I froze as I reached my window overlooking the woods. It was there, just beyond the tree line, staring back at me. Its face twisted into a horrible smile, revealing countless sharp teeth stained red with blood. Its long, gangly limbs contorted grotesquely as it slowly disappeared back into the darkness. I wanted to scream, but my throat locked up. Paralyzed by fear, all I could do was watch as it vanished, leaving me alone with the horrifying realization that it was real, and it knew I'd seen it. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in bed, a cold, damp cloth pressed against my forehead. My mom sat beside my bed, asleep in a chair, clearly having watched over me. Glancing at the clock, I noticed it was almost midnight. I lay still, trembling in the silence, unable to shake the terror of what I had witnessed, and the certainty that it was still out there, waiting hungry. Shadow Soldiers from Lost Times, from Private M20. This story might not be the most frightening one, but I want to share my encounters with whatever lurks in the woods of Austria. I am hoping someone can tell me what exactly I encountered. Before I start, I want to mention that English isn't my first language, so please excuse any mistakes. I hope you can still understand my experiences clearly. I'm currently 20 years old, and I joined the Austrian army when I was 19. I live in the rural countryside of Lower Austria, a place where every household tends to own at least a few acres of land. The area around me is an enchanting but eerie blend of dense, dark woods, sprawling open fields, and majestic mountains that stretch across the entire country. Ever since I was a young child, I spent most of my free time playing soldier in these woods with my friends. We would reenact imaginary battles and spend hours exploring and wandering deeper into the wilderness, without a care in the world. One specific summer afternoon stands out in my memory. My friends, who I'll refer to as F, P, and J, were with me playing games in our favorite wooded area. We were so engrossed in our play that we didn't notice the sunlight fading into twilight until it was nearly too dark to navigate our way back. Realizing how late it had become, we quickly turned to head home. By then, we were about 15 minutes deep into the thickest part of the forest. This was the first time I saw the shadows, what I've since come to think of as lost souls. Just as we were about to leave the forest, something caught the corner of my eye. Turning slightly, I saw the figure of a man standing motionlessly about 20 meters away among the trees. I paused, startled, and asked my friends if they saw him as well. Confused, they looked around but saw nothing. They joked about it, thinking I was simply tired or trying to scare them. I laughed along and shrugged it off, though I knew deep down that I had seen something real. Over the years that followed, sightings of these lost souls became somewhat common for me. At first, I found it disturbing and unnerving, but eventually I grew used to their silent, shadowy appearances. They never harmed or even approached me, but their presence always brought a strange sense of melancholy. I never understood who or what they truly were until I was 16 years old, and my father finally explained the history behind those woods. One evening, he told me these woods had once been a significant battlefield during World War I. He described the violent and tragic events that unfolded there. Just about a kilometer from our home, there stood 3 distinct hills known as Franzosenhügel, translating to Hills of the French. He explained how countless French soldiers lost their lives there, their bodies buried hastily in mass graves right where they fell. He added that even today, relics and ammunition from those battles occasionally surface, remnants of a dark and violent past. My last encounter with these lost souls occurred about a week ago. I was returning home after spending a few days at my military base. The journey took me along the familiar winding country road cutting through the dense woods. I felt strangely uneasy, an unsettling sense of sadness weighing heavily upon me. This wasn't the usual discomfort or fear I sometimes felt in these woods. It was deeper, almost mournful. Despite the growing anxiety, I pushed the feeling away, eager to visit my father. As I approached the area near the 3 hills, a movement caught my attention. My eyes widened as I clearly spotted a shadow-like figure lying on the ground, its form human yet indistinct, and another figure seemingly rushing towards it. The scene was brief, but painfully vivid, like a moment frozen in time from long ago. For the first time, these shadows were not fleeting images. They were more substantial, darker, and filled with palpable emotion. It felt as though these shadows were revealing their pain, their suffering from a conflict long past. Driving past, my heart was pounding, my mind struggling to comprehend the powerful experience. Perhaps, I thought, it was my army uniform that made the souls more visible, as if recognizing me as a soldier had triggered their appearance in a more defined way. When I finally arrived at my father's home, I immediately described what I'd just experienced. To my surprise, he didn't seem shocked. Instead, I saw understanding and, oddly enough, relief in his eyes. It felt as though he'd had similar encounters, but had never spoken about them. When I asked him directly if he had ever witnessed anything similar, he hesitated, then simply warned me to never stop the car or leave the road if I saw those shadows again. His reaction only deepened my curiosity and unease. What exactly were these shadows? Were they echoes of soldiers trapped eternally by the violence they'd faced? Or did they seek something else entirely? As a member of the Austrian army myself, was there some deeper connection to my presence that they responded to? I am left with questions I cannot answer, and an experience that continues to haunt me. If anyone reading this has encountered something similar, or knows anything about this phenomenon, please feel free to reach out. I'd genuinely appreciate insights or explanations. Even now, I'm uncertain whether what I have witnessed is a sign of something meaningful or a harbinger of something darker. What is living on my father's land? From Gothic Redhead 99. Hi, you can call me Red. I'd like to share with you my encounters I had growing up. Trigger warning, this includes violence against animals. For starters, I am now 25 years old and haven't been back to the place where this all happened for quite some time. In all honesty, I'm afraid to. My father, on the other hand, still lives there, so let's get into it. We moved into this house back in 2010. It was nice. There were 13 acres in total. We had a huge field for our horses, and the rest was forest. Me and my 2 siblings never had that kind of space or freedom before, so we were excited to explore. The first encounter with this creature happened in 2012. We had built a big outdoor pen for our 3 dogs. They were Akitas, so quite a large breed, and they weren't crazy about being inside. We normally fed them around 6 p.m. before it started to get dark, but it was around 11 when we returned home from an all-day family event. I was getting their bowls ready when I realized they were going absolutely nuts. They were used to deer and other wildlife, so this was out of the norm for them. They seemed fearful and aggressive. I set the bowls down and grabbed a flashlight to see what the commotion was about. I scanned the dark until I came across a pair of eyes staring at me. They were yellowish-white in color and fixed on me. They were crouched behind the riding lawnmower we had that was next to the dog pen. My flashlight didn't quite reach the distance they were at very well, but I assumed it was possibly a deer, until, all of a sudden, they rose. They were way higher than a deer and a little taller than my father, so maybe about 6 feet off the ground. I screamed and dropped the bowls and ran to get my dad. He didn't think much of it, and it was gone by the time we got back. This encounter led to a chain of events that were gruesome, to say the least. Every day for the next month, we would find mangled animals scattered throughout our yard and left on our porch. The biggest being a doe that was sliced from the neck to the underbelly. Luckily, our animals were never harmed, but it was sad nonetheless. We had no explanation for it. We had a neighbor, but he was elderly and kind. What was doing this, and why? My father ended up getting security cameras. He was an ex-military man and was putting on an unbothered face, but I could tell he was a little freaked out. These cameras would turn a light on when they detected movement. We had them for about a week when we started to notice the lights were constantly turned on and objects were being thrown at them and the house. It was a fancy trailer-type house, so there were cameras on all four corners, but the back porch and front porch were accessible without triggering them. I would hear footsteps on the porch at night, tapping on my window. One night, I had a carcass of a possum thrown at my window. I was terrified and dreaded having to sleep. My last encounter before leaving to move in with my mother was in 2014. It was December, and we just had a heavy snowfall. I had one of my dogs out playing. She was pure white and blended in perfectly with the snow. All you saw was explosions of powder when she ran by. She was zooming around until she suddenly came to a halt and focused on the tree line where the first encounter happened. I immediately felt my stomach drop, and everything went quiet except the wind. She began to get anxious, and her hackles raised. I was looking around frantically, and then I saw it. It was a good distance away, but it was peeking behind a tree. I was too far to see facial features, but it looked dark and had a kind of cone-shaped head. It watched for about a minute before realizing we were looking at it as well, and it took off on two legs. It was so fast and looked human almost. It disappeared into another section of the forest, and I didn't see it again. Xena never chased it. I could tell she was uneasy. We immediately went back inside, and I asked if I could live with my mom. I visit my father still. He lives in the same place. I never stay the night, and he gets quiet when I ask if weird things still go on there. He always says no, but I can see it on his face. I also noticed he fenced up the area around his house. I don't know what this creature was or is. All I know is I don't want to come across it again. Large animal staring me down. From Michigan Man 7. My name is Eric, and I've lived on the same rural property in northern Michigan for nearly 20 years. My land sits right at the edge of a dense forest, and while it's usually peaceful, I've seen plenty of wildlife wander through my backyard over the years. Deer, foxes, raccoons, nothing out of the ordinary. But what I encountered last winter was unlike anything I had ever experienced before, and honestly, I hope I never do again. It was mid-January, and we were deep into a harsh winter. The snow had been piling up for weeks, and temperatures were staying well below freezing. My house sits about 2 acres back from the road, and the backyard slopes gently toward a thick wooded area. With most of the leaves gone, visibility into the trees was usually pretty good, especially with the snow providing contrast. That day, I was out clearing my driveway after a heavy overnight snowfall. It was around 3 in the afternoon, and even though the sun was out, it didn't offer much warmth. My breath clouded in front of me as I shoveled, the rhythmic scrape of metal against asphalt echoing in the crisp, silent air. At one point I paused, stretching my back and glancing toward the tree line out of habit. That's when I saw it. At first I didn't fully register what I was looking at. It was large, very large, and standing perfectly still among the barren trees about 50 yards away. My initial thought was that it was a strange-shaped tree, or maybe a deer standing upright, which didn't really make sense. But as I squinted through the sunlight reflecting off the snow, details became clearer, and my confusion quickly turned into disbelief. This creature was standing on two legs, easily 8 feet tall, covered head to toe in thick, dark fur. Its upper body was broad and muscular, shoulders noticeably wider than its waist, tapering down to strong-looking hind legs that resembled a dog's more than a human's. The most unsettling part, though, was its head. It had a distinctly canine appearance, like a wolf or German shepherd, complete with pointed ears sitting atop its head. Its eyes, even from that distance, seemed to reflect a subtle amber glow. A surge of adrenaline rushed through me. I froze, gripping my shovel tighter as every muscle in my body tensed. My first thought was that it was someone in a suit or a weird prank. But there were no footprints leading into that area from anywhere visible, and the sheer size and animalistic posture were too convincing. Plus, nobody in their right mind would be out in this weather, miles away from town, just waiting to scare one random person clearing his driveway. We stared at each other, or at least it felt like it was staring directly at me, for what must have been a minute, though it felt much longer. Neither of us moved. The quiet of the winter afternoon seemed suddenly oppressive, every slight creak or snap from the surrounding trees echoing like gunshots in my ears. Finally, the creature shifted its weight slightly, revealing a massive paw-like hand with what looked like long claws at the ends of its fingers. That was all it took. Fear took over, and I quickly backed away toward my house, never taking my eyes off the creature. It didn't follow, but it also didn't retreat. It simply stood its ground, watching as I scrambled up the steps and into the safety of my home. Locking the door behind me, I rushed to my kitchen window, which faced that part of my yard. But when I looked out again, the creature had vanished. I spent the rest of that afternoon peering through various windows, half expecting the thing to reappear at any moment. I called a few neighbors, discreetly asking if they'd seen anything unusual around the woods lately. Nobody had, and I didn't push further, afraid they'd think I'd lost my mind. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, listening intently for any unusual sounds outside, but heard nothing beyond the typical creaks and groans of a house settling in the cold. By morning, I convinced myself that maybe I'd overreacted, that perhaps the light and shadows had played tricks on me. Still, curiosity, and maybe a need for validation, got the better of me. After breakfast, I dressed warmly and cautiously made my way to the spot where the creature had stood. Sure enough, I found footprints. They were massive, at least 14 inches long, clearly canine but distorted, elongated by the heel as if bearing weight on 2 legs instead of 4. I followed the tracks carefully into the woods for about 30 yards, before losing them among the denser brush and uneven snow. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I'd find myself awake at odd hours, standing quietly near windows, staring out toward the tree line. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear strange noises from deep within the woods, low growls, sharp snapping sounds, even the occasional howl echoing eerily in the silence. Each sound sent chills down my spine, reinforcing the sense of vulnerability that now permeated my peaceful home. Several nights later, I woke abruptly, convinced that I had heard footsteps crunching through the snow near my window. Heart racing, I moved slowly to peer outside. Moonlight illuminated the snow-covered yard, but I saw nothing out of place, just undisturbed snow stretching to the tree line. Despite the lack of visible evidence, the distinct feeling of being watched never left me. The rest of that winter, I didn't see it again clearly, yet my anxiety remained high. Daily routines now carried an underlying tension. Every day I found myself checking that same area, a habit born of both dread and curiosity. Each time I stepped outside, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement between trees, shadows shifting too quickly, shapes melting back into the woods before my eyes could focus clearly. Even now, nearly a year later, the memory remains vivid. I'm not someone who jumps to wild conclusions, but I know what I saw. Whatever it was, a dog man, a creature unknown to science, or something else entirely, it was real, and it was standing right there at the edge of my property in broad daylight. I still live in the same house, and I still look toward that tree line every time I walk outside. Winter's approaching again, and I wonder if the creature will return, standing silent among the bare trees, waiting to be seen once more. The Hills of Honduras, from Gearhead 993. The following story takes place in 2010. I was a sophomore in high school around this time, and being a free-spirited teenager, the thought of traveling out of the U.S. intrigued me. So, when I was presented the opportunity to serve on a mission trip to Honduras, I immediately jumped at the chance. Several months of preparations later, I found myself on a plane headed south on a new adventure. It was me, and my dad followed by 8 other members of our church. 10 people in total. The plan was to spend the summer building a new school building for the neighborhood kids of Honduras. When we arrived, we were met with a driver who drove us by bus 3 hours through the downtown to a little town up in the hills of Honduras. Now, in order to move forward with this story, I need to stop right here and tell you another story. If you have never been to Honduras, the driving scene there is absolutely ridiculous. According to the laws, the traffic lights, stop signs, etc., are only recommendations there. If you thought driving in your town was nuts, an average day in the U.S. pales in comparison to a midday drive in Honduras. I counted probably 48 different times we almost died over the course of this 3-hour drive. Surprisingly, 3 hours later, we found ourselves at our destination without incident. Upon arrival, I noticed right off the bat that the townspeople there were surprisingly very friendly. The children were very excited to meet us. In my 6 or 7 months of preparation, I studied up a little on my Spanish and was able to somewhat communicate with them, which took the children by surprise. So you can imagine I was a group favorite. One boy in particular I struck a friendship with really quick. For this story, we'll call him Mark. Now Mark was about 5 or 6 years younger than me at the time, and was one of the oldest boys in the neighborhood. So, as you can imagine, we grew very close very quickly. Kindred spirits, you might say. As the weeks went by, me and Mark got into a number of shenanigans together. One time we actually stole a golf cart and later crashed it into a nearby chicken coop. But that's another story for another time. Needless to say, for the most part, that was one of the best summers of my life. That is, until me and Mark decided to explore the woods. Which brings us to the story at hand. One afternoon nearing the end of the summer, the group was finishing up on the school building, except for some miscellaneous wiring and things that needed tidying up. It was a particular hot day, and Mark approached me and told me of a nearby spring that was perfect for cooling off in, but to get to it we had to venture through some woods that were supposedly haunted and seemed to, quote, come alive after dark. Me being the fearless individual I am, chalked it up to stories the adults told the kids to scare them into keeping them from wandering off alone in the woods. I soon found out I'd eat these words. So, after a few minutes of arguing over whether either one of us was chicken or not, we were on our way. After about 30 minutes and several left turns that were supposed to be rights, we finally found the spring. As we arrived, we found a rope swing that told us we were not the only ones who'd been here before. We spent the better part of the afternoon cooling off in the water and headed home before dark. The next day, we did the same thing, but as we arrived the next day, we noticed the rope swing was missing. I thought this rather odd because the branch was still there, but the rope was now gone. So that means someone would have had to come, climb the tree, and remove it by hand. I'd asked Mark if he had anything to do with it. He told me he hadn't been back since I was with him the day before. After a few minutes of pondering without coming up with a reasonable answer, we decided to just let it go and hopped into the water. As we got in the water, I also noticed that the water was much colder than it was the day before. But as anyone knows, water temp in a mountain river can vary from one day to another, so I didn't think much of it. At least that's what my young teenage mind told me. As the afternoon drew to a close and the sun began to set, we headed home, but while on our way, we began to notice the trail we usually take began to change. Branches began to move. The wind began to blow. Shadows started to appear where there were none before. And before we knew it, our trail had vanished, and we were lost. Lost in the hills of Honduras, with no way out. As the forest grew dark, I took out my phone and turned on the light. What we saw when the light came on still haunts me to this day. As the light shone in front of us, what stood before us was a figure. It appeared to be a woman, but she wasn't human. She looked disfigured. Her skin was gray and distorted and appeared to look like charred cedar. Her arms were like the branches of an oak tree, long and skinny, with little twigs perforating from them. As I took a step backwards, trembling, her fingers began to extend as to reach out to grab us. We both screamed and turned to run, but Mark had somehow gotten his foot wrapped up in what appeared to be tree roots. Luckily, he carried with him a machete on his hip, and quick as a whip, he chopped away the roots, allowing his foot to break loose, and stumbled to his feet. As he sliced through the roots, the figure let out a shriek that made my blood run cold. We took off running as quickly as we could. Mark was a little bit faster than me, so he ran ahead and slashed as fast as his arms would let him, creating a new trail for us to run through. We tore through the woods for what seemed like hours, but truthfully, just a few minutes. Soon we noticed we weren't being chased. Mark asked, "Do you think it's safe to stop and catch our breath?" I wanted to say no, but my legs felt like jello at this point. All at once, I just collapsed to the ground. What happened shortly after this is a blur. Next thing I knew, I was waking up back in the village, out of the woods. I'm told Mark, in a feat of adrenaline, pulled me through the brush out of the woods to safety. We tried to explain to the group what had happened, but as adults typically are, no one believed us. They chalked it up to two rambunctious teenagers getting lost in the woods. And I mean, after all, me and Mark raised a lot of hell that summer, so it wasn't all that shocking that no one wanted to believe two troublesome teenagers. To this day, I still don't know how we managed to make it out of that forest alive. What did the tree woman want with Mark and I? And why did it stop chasing us? And how did a machete of all things fend off a creature of that magnitude that defied all logical explanation? Whatever it was, whatever the case, we lived to tell the tale. Summer ended, and I found myself back stateside. I tried to keep in contact with Mark after what happened, but he became distant, not wanting much to do with me. I was angry about this, but didn't hold a grudge because, well, could you blame the guy? A traumatic experience like that is bound to drive a wedge in any friendship. For a long time, I blocked out that experience and had just kind of wrote it off. Fast forward to about 5 years ago, I received a letter in the mail. Examining it, I then noticed the return address. Honduras, Mark! I thought. I quickly opened it, and sure enough, it was him. "Hello, old friend," it said. "I hope you are well. I am writing to tell you of some exciting news. I am going to be a dad. As this opens a new chapter of my life, I felt I could not open this door without first closing another." He went on to tell me he had received the letters I sent, but he was very disturbed by the incident and tried to block every memory of it away. And that is why he never wrote back, because by talking about it, it made the experience real, and he just wanted to move on. But now, with this new chapter of his life opening, he wanted to try and make amends for it, so he could move on with a clear conscience. So I wrote him back and made everything right with him, and we are now best of friends again. He told me he had since moved out of the village and into the city with his now wife. He also said that he still keeps in contact with family living in the village, and said that he had received word that the forest land had been bought by a developer a few years ago, but production had stopped because some workers had mysteriously gone missing. This was altogether interesting, because at the time of receiving this letter, it was almost 10 years to the day of the incident. Coincidence? Maybe. Maybe not. One thing, however, is certain. There is something dark, something evil, that lurks in the hills of Honduras. Something followed my daughter and I while hunting. From Anonymous. I've spent most of my life hunting in the deep woods of Pennsylvania. It's a tradition I inherited from my dad, and when my daughter Emma turned 14, I was eager to pass down the tradition to her. It wasn't just about hunting. It was about spending time together and teaching her respect for nature. But one trip we took about 2 years ago ended up being something neither of us expected or ever forgot. It was late November, and the leaves had already carpeted the forest floor in deep layers of reds and browns. It was Emma's first hunting trip, and we woke up around 4 in the morning, both excited and groggy. We packed up our gear, grabbed our rifles, dressed warmly, and set out to a secluded spot in the woods that I'd used many times before. The morning was crisp and quiet, the air cool enough to see our breath as we walked along the narrow dirt trail. As we moved further into the forest, Emma whispered about how eerie and peaceful it felt to be surrounded by silence like this. She was right. It was a unique stillness, comforting yet unnerving at the same time. We reached my usual spot by dawn, setting up a makeshift blind near a small clearing. It overlooked a game trail deer frequently used. We settled in, the woods slowly coming alive around us as the sun rose higher, birds starting to chirp and squirrels darting around the leaf litter. It seemed like any other hunting day, perfectly normal. We'd been sitting quietly for maybe 2 hours when Emma suddenly tapped my shoulder. "Dad," she whispered, her voice tense. "Did you hear that?" I strained my ears, listening carefully. At first, I heard nothing unusual, just the typical rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. But after a few moments, I noticed something odd, a faint humming sound, low-pitched and rhythmic, coming from deeper within the forest. It was subtle, but once noticed, impossible to ignore. "Probably machinery from the farms nearby," I suggested quietly, but Emma shook her head slowly. She seemed uneasy, her eyes scanning the trees nervously. We tried to refocus, but as the minutes passed, the humming grew louder and more pronounced, as though whatever was making it was moving closer. The animals had gone silent, the normal forest activity abruptly stopping, amplifying the bizarre sound. The air around us grew heavy, oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Emma gripped my arm, her fingers trembling slightly. "Dad, something feels really wrong," she whispered urgently. My instinct told me she was right. Whatever this was, it didn't feel normal or safe. I quickly decided our hunting trip was over. "Let's pack up," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We gathered our things hastily, and just as we were ready to move, the humming stopped, abruptly, completely, replaced instantly by absolute silence. It was chilling. Then, from somewhere close but hidden, came a sharp snapping sound, the loud crack of a large branch being broken. My heart began to pound, and Emma looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. We stayed perfectly still, listening, waiting, unsure what to do next. Then came another sound, a guttural, throaty growl, deeper than anything I'd heard in my years of hunting. It resonated through the trees, vibrating in my chest, paralyzing us momentarily with shock. "Dad!" Emma began, panic rising in her voice, but I motioned her to be quiet. "Follow me," I whispered, slowly raising my rifle, pointing toward the trail leading back out. We moved cautiously at first, careful not to make noise, but the growling persisted, now joined by faint rustling movements around us, circling unseen in the underbrush. We quickened our pace, abandoning stealth for speed. Behind us, branches cracked again, closer this time, followed by heavy, rhythmic footsteps. Something large was definitely following us. Emma started to cry quietly, stumbling slightly as she hurried, and I took her hand firmly, pulling her along as fast as we could manage through the dense woods. As we fled, the forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing longer and more ominous. The growling intensified, echoing as though the creature was directly behind us, matching our pace step for step. I looked back briefly, but saw nothing except the dense wall of trees and thickening gloom. We broke into a full run, our breaths harsh and desperate. Every footstep behind us felt closer, heavier, and more threatening. My rifle felt heavy and useless in my hands. Whatever was out there felt beyond ordinary animals, almost supernatural. Emma tripped, and I quickly pulled her up, adrenaline pushing us forward as the sound of snapping branches came alarmingly close. When we finally reached our truck, parked at the edge of the forest, relief flooded through us. We practically jumped inside, locking the doors immediately. I turned the ignition, and as the engine roared to life, my headlights illuminated the tree line directly in front of us. That's when we saw it. For just a brief second, standing partially hidden between two massive oak trees, was a tall, shadowy figure, at least 7 feet high, broad-shouldered, its eyes reflecting a dull yellow glow. It shifted slightly, a quick movement that confirmed its size and bulk before disappearing instantly into the darkness. Emma and I stared at each other, unable to speak, breathless and terrified. I didn't hesitate further. I threw the truck into gear and sped away from those woods faster than I'd ever driven before. Neither of us spoke during the ride home. Later, at home, as Emma finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, I sat awake, staring out the window into the darkness, replaying every detail in my mind. To this day, Emma refuses to go back into those woods, and truthfully, neither have I. Whatever we encountered that morning wasn't something explainable by logic or reason, and it's a memory neither of us can ever forget. The Man in the Woods. From Guy Who Is Bad at Writing Goo. This story initially happened to my younger brother, but he gave me permission to share it here. It was a cold, snowy winter day, perfect for sledding. Our property had this massive hill in the backyard that stretched far from our house, hidden enough that our parents couldn't see anyone playing there from inside. My brother, who was about 10 years old at the time, decided to spend the afternoon racing down that giant slope on his sled. After several exhilarating runs, he was racing downhill once again when he suddenly hit a hidden root. The sled flipped, throwing him off and sending him tumbling into the soft, powdery snow. Shaken but unharmed, he brushed himself off and stood up, preparing to climb back up the hill. That's when he saw it. Standing right in front of him was an impossibly tall figure, about 9 feet tall, dressed entirely in black. What truly terrified him was the mask, stark white, jagged, and sinister, contrasting sharply against its dark form. Frozen in fear for only a brief moment, he then let out a terrified scream and bolted up the hill, running as fast as he possibly could through the heavy snow. Glancing back, he saw nothing but a set of huge, unsettling footprints trailing off into the forest. For a long while afterward, my brother refused to set foot in those woods again. He spoke often about the man in the woods, and though it was easy to dismiss as a child's imagination, something in his voice made it feel chillingly real. But then, just a couple of weeks later, my friends and I, along with my brother, were exploring those same woods from our neighbor Jack's property. My brother nervously mentioned the figure again, recounting his previous encounter. Initially skeptical but still curious, we all grew uneasy as we walked deeper into the forest. Suddenly, Jack stopped dead in his tracks, pointing toward a distant shape hidden among the trees. We all stared in shock. There it was, the impossibly tall, black-clothed figure, wearing that jagged white mask, standing ominously still. Panic surged through us, and we immediately bolted toward the nearest structure, a nearby farm building, hoping for safety. But as we reached the building, we saw the figure again, standing in silent menace at the edge of the woods, watching us. Screaming in unison, we ran frantically back to Jack's house and locked the doors behind us. Even now, weeks later, I shiver thinking about that day, knowing that whatever we saw out there might still be lurking, hidden in the shadows of those woods. Thanks for stopping by our little campsite here at Outdoor Terrors. To hear your story on the show, send it to us at darkstories.org. For more scary stories from me, catch me on my other podcasts, Unexplained Encounters and Tales from the Break Room, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Or go to eeriecast.com for those and even more terrifying podcasts. Follow me on X or Twitter at Dark Prevails, and if you don't mind, leave a rating for Outdoor Terrors on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Till next time, I'll see you soon when the campfire blazes once again.